Hello once again. Today we're talking about villain exits. Villains are a fun construct. I think it's probably the peak joy of running a RPG of any sort, is coming up with really fun villains so you can villain at people and do villain things. Villains are fun. We all love villains. But there is a phenomenon, an event, you might call it, that I call the villain exit. And this occurs when the villain has engaged with the players in some way. And this is a thing that happens in other forms of media, but I'm going to frame it specifically for RPGs. The villain has engaged with the players in some way. The fight is happening. They fight and they fight and they fight. And now the villain needs to leave. There could be a number of reasons for this. Either the villain is getting beaten and they need to escape alive, or they need to, or like they're on a time crunch and they maybe would win the fight, but they don't have time to really invest in it. Like it's taking longer to kill the players than they anticipated. So they just need to leave, go do something else instead. Maybe something else is about to happen. They need to go stop, or that they need to go do. Whatever it is, they need to leave the scene and they need to leave alive. So they are going to perform a villain exit. There are a few different ways to handle this, and some are better than others. So most of the time in the context of D&D, you're going to have a villain that teleports away or turns invisible and then leaves. In some way, like, I am done fighting and I'm going to remove myself from the situation safely and kind of suddenly, usually. Now, what I have seen happen is like a good way to do this. Or no, let's start with the bad way to do this, and then I'll just explain what I think is a good way to do this. The bad way to do this is to wait for the villain to run out of hit points, and then further damage doesn't matter, and then they're out of there with no further interaction. When their next turn comes up, they teleport away using a non-spell, so you can't counterspell it, or you cut to. See, it's difficult to make generalizations because there's so many different factors in play here. But basically, letting them hit 0 and then just dipping out without the players being able to in any way interact with it, that feels bad. It's maybe not the worst way to do it, but it is a feel bad way, because like as a player, I feel like I earned the kill, right? And especially if you're using a system or if you're doing what I do, where I'm fully open with enemy hit points. It is so, man, I keep interrupting myself because I'm thinking of like edge cases and like the better ways to do it. So if the enemy hits 0, there's an expectation on the part of the players that they have defeated the enemy and that they are now unconscious, which is the same as if they had hit 0. If their own character had run out of hit points, they would be unconscious and basically helpless. And so they are going to expect to kill the enemy at that point. What I think is a much better thing to do, actually, is to straight up double the enemy's hit points, or their health pool, or whatever is appropriate for your particular RPG. Make them twice as durable, and then when they hit halfway, then they're going to initiate their exit. And what I don't think you should do is suddenly interrupt the fight and have them disappear. I think it should wait until their next turn. That's why you double their health. And then use in-game mechanics that exist already in order to remove the villain from the area. Now, if it's like a powerful wizard or something like that, first off, the main characters that are usually able to teleport away easily are also the characters that can usually just take the fall. A powerful wizard in 5e is going to have access to the clone spell. A lich is going to be able to just reformat the phylactery. These kinds of characters, they can afford to die. And if that's the case, let the players kill it. If they got it fair, if they earned the victory, let them have it. But not everyone does. You know, if you're not doing a wizard, or if it's like a demon of some sort, or some sort of eldritch creature that doesn't have access to the entire spell list, they don't have the clone, like killing them would be a meaningful defeat in these cases. They need to escape alive. What they should do is interact with the mechanics as they exist in the game, so that the players feel like they have some amount of agency. Now, by all means, pull out all the stops, because you have your villain, whether it be a campaign villain or the villain of a particular story arc or whatever, you have your villain in the same room as the player characters, and that's rarely a good idea. So actually, my number one piece of advice is, if you don't want your bad guy dead, don't put him in the same room with the player characters, because they're going to kill stuff. That's what they do. They are built to overcome obstacles, and they are going to overcome the heck out of that obstacle, especially if they know that it is like a major villain. They're gonna absolutely go full speed ahead on this fight, and they're gonna kill that guy. So, A, don't put him in the same room as the player characters. B, if they is in the same room as the player characters and needs to escape, do it fairly. Don't rob the players by having some sort of arbitrary, it's not a spell, but it does work exactly like a spell, where I teleport out and there's nothing you can do about it. There's no interaction, there's no reactions, there's no nothing. That feels bad. It feels cheap, and it feels like robbing the players of their victory. And if you do that too much and rely on it too much, it can actually cheapen the campaign, because then the players sort of get the sense that they're only going to achieve victory when you feel like they're ready. When you have decided that they are ready to actually have their victory. And then it feels super arbitrary. Like, why try if you're not going to get your win until the DM says so. So don't make a cheap escape. Play within the rules, but use competent resources. You know, if you are going to cast a teleport spell and the players want to counterspell, you can counterspell. You can counterspell their counterspell to get out of there. Now, if they have a second counterspell and they want to burn that, they earn that. They've spent the resources to interact with this mechanic and to stop you from escaping. That's why you've doubled their hit points. They can last maybe a couple more rounds in the thick of it, and you could try to teleport away again on the next turn. I've had situations where a bad guy was supposed to escape from the player characters, by turning invisible and then sneaking away, and their stealth score was very high, but the players had a ranger in the party, and that ranger had a very high perception, and they were able to spot her, and they did a bunch of damage to her, and she got away, I kid you not, with 1 hit point left. That was close. And I think I was a new enough DM at the time that I probably would have just fudged it, even if it hadn't been that close. Which I don't recommend doing, and so honestly, I've been having a debate with somebody. Debate is a generous word for what's going on. I've been having a discussion about honesty as a game master, and I'm probably going to do another video on it soon. I know I've done one already, but I'm going to do something a little bit more comprehensive. I don't recommend cheating to get the villain out. If you have to cheat to get the villain out, the villain should not have been there in the first place. See rule number 1, don't put the villain in the same room with the player characters unless you are ready for it to die, because that's probably what's going to happen. The player characters are very good at killing things. What nearly every feature and spell in the entire game is there to do. So what I would say is, if you are planning on a scene where the villain is going to fight the player characters and then escape, there's a couple of things to consider. Be fair. Prepare for your preparations to fail. Have fallbacks. And also have a good reason why a villain that has previously escaped and that they will presumably encounter later is still a threat. You can level up the villain with the party so that it stays comparable to them, more or less the same challenge rating, or the challenge relative to them. But that can stretch credulity. mainly because leveling up as player characters is kind of an abstract thing. It's not something that you really think about, but you do expect that if you fight the same thing at a higher level, it should be easier. And if you've beaten the villain before, you don't expect the villain to have leveled up. It's not like you can, but it's not something that intuitively should happen. And it can kind of remove some of the mystique of the level system. It makes it a little bit more obvious that the leveling up mechanics are kind of abstract and, let's be honest, pretty arbitrary. And you want to do what you can to not remove that curtain as long as possible. Obviously, you can only do so much. So what I don't recommend is just leveling up the villain for no reason. Now, if the villain has some way to power themselves up, like maybe that's why they escaped, because they're not at full power yet. They haven't accomplished their goals yet. They haven't achieved their ends. And they're going to do that later and become more powerful. And then they're going to fight the party, and then it's going to be different. Except it's not, because now the party has leveled up and they can handle it. And now it is a harder fight relative to their current level. That's something you can definitely do. So the villain can power up and then face the party. The villain can acquire allies so that the second time they face the villain is not alone. And maybe that's what makes the difference. That would be hard to do in a way that works out really well, just because of the way that like single monsters work in D&D and like the difficulty of balancing an encounter at higher level by adding more monsters. It's hard to pull off, and so I don't recommend it for that reason. But conceptually, it makes sense. Get allies, fight is harder, and therefore it is more satisfying. But usually when you have a big villain like this that you have fought before and now you're going to fight again, it's the kind of villain that you mostly want to be by themselves, or maybe with some minions, but not with like real beefy, actual legitimate threat allies. So you could do either of those. The issue then, because you don't want to diminish the perceived threat of this villain. And maybe this villain is supposed to not be the final threat. This can really work with the villain escape, where, you fight the villain when it is an appropriate, challenging encounter, and then you're going to win, so the villain escapes. And then later in the campaign, you fight the same villain again. It's not leveled up. You crush him because you're much higher level now. And then it is revealed that villain actually works for a higher villain, or, has already accomplished his goals, and it's too late for you now. These are all things that could happen. So have a plan in mind so that one, prepare for them to die. Two, have contingencies in case their escape doesn't work. Their initial escape attempt doesn't work. Three, have a reason for a future encounter with this villain to still be challenging and satisfying, narratively appropriate. So these are the things you have to consider when doing a villain exit. Personally, a lot of my villains tend not to change in their power level over the course of a campaign. They tend to be quite distant. Like, you don't usually see them until the very end, except in certain specific contexts where they are not facing the party directly. Like, maybe you see them in the distance, or, what I have done is have the villain fighting an entire fleet of airships that includes the party as one of them. And so in this case, it's sort of the inverse of the villain gaining allies. In this case, the villain has no allies, but the party has a huge number of allies. And so it is an entirely different kind of fight. And of course, even though he is very powerful, he's much more powerful than the player characters, still struggles against the vast numbers that the player characters are able to bring against him with their allies. And then later on in the campaign, they will face him alone, and now because they're more powerful, they are able to do so. These are the kinds of things to consider. Consider why the challenge of the villain continues to scale with the player characters, and I think just arbitrarily leveling it up with them is not that satisfying. So those are my thoughts on villain exits do with them what you will.